The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the brutal December sun of 1879, its short grass prairie broken only by scattered mesquite and the distant purple shadows of mountains that seemed to mock any hope of shelter. Two horses thundered across this desolate landscape, their hooves drumming a desperate rhythm against earth baked hard as pottery by generations of unforgiving heat. The first rider, a young woman in a torn brown wool dress, clutched a bulging canvas satchel to her chest as if her very soul depended on its contents. Behind her, gaining ground with each passing moment despite his horse's labored breathing, rode Conrad Dietrich, a man whose pale eyes had watched children disappear into darkness without a flicker of conscience. His weathered face, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, bore the expression of a predator who had finally cornered his prey after a hunt that had lasted far too long. "Stop running, girl." Dietrich's voice carried across the wind, harsh as the cry of a circling buzzard. "You're only making this harder on yourself and that sister of yours." The mention of Nellie sent fresh terror coursing through Elise Brennan's veins. At 20 years old, she still carried the careful mannerisms of her European upbringing, though months in this harsh land had begun to etch lines of hardship around her green eyes. The satchel pressed against her ribs contained more than stolen ledgers. It held evidence of horrors that reached far beyond simple theft crimes that turned children into commodities and law into mockery. The mare beneath her, a gentle creature named Rosie, that had pulled supply wagons rather than racing across dangerous terrain, stumbled slightly as they crested a low rise. Her sides heaved with exhaustion, foam flecking her bridle as she fought to maintain her pace across ground riddled with hidden dangers. Prairie dog holes dotted the landscape like landmines, each one capable of snapping a horse's leg and ending any hope of escape. Dietrich's lasso sang through the air with practiced precision, the hemp rope uncoiling like a striking serpent. Elise ducked low over her mare's neck, feeling the rough fibers brush her hair as the loop missed by mere inches. The near miss caused Rosie to shy violently to the left, her iron shoes striking sparks from a half-buried stone. "Blast you!" Dietrich cursed, coiling his rope with movements that spoke of decades spent handling livestock and worse. This time, he promised himself the loop would find its mark. The prairie dog burrow appeared without warning, a seemingly innocent depression in the grass that might as well have been a canyon for all the devastation it caused. Rosie's front leg disappeared into the hole up to the knee, with a sickening snap of bone that echoed across the empty landscape. Horse and rider went down in a tangle of limbs and dust, Elise's scream lost in the thunder of her own pulse as she tumbled through a patch of barrel cactus. Spines tore through her dress sleeves like dozens of tiny knives, leaving bloody tracks on her arms, while gravel bit deep into her palms as she skidded to a stop. The satchel flew from her grasp, landing 10 feet away in a cloud of dust that glittered in the harsh sunlight like powdered gold. Through the haze of pain and disorientation, she watched Dietrich dismount with deliberate slowness, savoring his moment of triumph. His boots hit the ground with thuds that seemed to shake the very earth, while in his right hand, a Colt revolver caught the afternoon light like a mirror reflecting judgment. "Should have minded your own business, Elise." Dietrich said, his voice carrying the casual tone of a man discussing the weather rather than murder. Some folks just never learn when to leave well enough alone. She crawled toward the satchel, her torn dress hampering her movements, while blood dripped from her arms onto earth so dry it absorbed the moisture instantly. "Please," she whispered, though she knew pleading would accomplish nothing with a man like Dietrich. "I was only trying to help those children, help." His laugh held no warmth, only the hollow sound of a soul that had forgotten what compassion meant. "You call destroying my livelihood, helping that ledger belongs to me, girl, and you had no right to take what wasn't yours." The hammer of his Colt clicked back with mechanical finality. Elise closed her eyes, her fingers still inches from the satchel that contained evidence of crimes spanning multiple territories. She thought of Nellie, barely 10 years old, and trapped somewhere in this vast wasteland, depending on a sister who had failed to protect her when it mattered most. The gunshot, when it came, shattered the desert silence with unexpected direction. Instead of the sharp crack of Dietrich's pistol, the report came from her left, followed immediately by the distinctive whine of a ricochet that sent Dietrich's weapon spinning from his grasp. The freight boss cursed and stumbled backward, his scarred face twisted with confusion and rage as he searched for the source of this impossible intervention. A third horse materialized from the heat shimmer, like an apparition, its riders seeming to flow rather than ride across the broken ground. The newcomer's carbine swept in a vicious arc, its wooden stock connecting with Dietrich's temple, with a sound like an axe biting into seasoned oak. The corrupt freight boss dropped without ceremony, blood streaming from his scalp as he struck the earth with bone-jarring force. The Apache scout, for that, was clearly what he was, dismounted in one fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. His weathered face bore the proud lines of his heritage, while dark eyes held depths that suggested both wisdom and carefully controlled violence. Most striking was the long scar that ran across his collarbone, visible where his buckskin shirt had pulled open during the fight. "Can you stand?" he asked in English, touched by the cadence of his native tongue, his voice carrying genuine concern despite the urgency of their situation. Elise nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain her legs would support her weight. The stranger helped her to her feet, with hands that were both gentle and strong, calloused by honest work, yet capable of swift violence when necessary. As he steadied her, she caught sight of something in his dark eyes, a recognition of pain that went beyond physical injury. "We need to move quickly," he said, scanning the horizon with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to reading danger in empty landscapes. "Dietrich rarely travels alone, and his men won't be far behind." As if summoned by his words, dust clouds appeared in the distance, multiple riders pushing their mounts hard across terrain that punished both horse and man with equal cruelty. The rescue had bought them precious minutes, but the hunt was far from over. The Apache scout lifted Elise onto his horse with careful efficiency, mindful of her injuries, while maintaining the alertness of someone who knew death could arrive from any direction. As they rode away from Dietrich's prone form, leaving him stirring groggily in the dust, she pressed her face against the stranger's back and whispered words that came from the depths of her despair. "It's too late for me," she said, her voice barely audible over the drumming of hooves on hardpan earth. They sought shelter in a shallow arroyo, carved by countless flash floods, its walls providing both concealment and protection from the wind that had begun to pick up as evening approached. Here in this temporary sanctuary, where ancient waters had carved refuge from an unforgiving world, the Apache scout finally turned to face the woman he had risked his life to save. Elise slumped against the sandy wall, her face pale and her hands shaking from shock as much as injury. Blood had dried in dark streaks on her arms, where the cactus spines had found their mark, while dirt and tears had combined to create patterns on her cheeks that resembled war paint applied by trembling fingers. Without words, the scout knelt before her and pressed his forehead gently against hers, his calloused hands coming to rest on her shoulders, with a touch that was both firm and infinitely compassionate. In that moment, with the dust and danger of their flight settling around them like the remnants of a shattered world, he spoke words that carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You'll live," he said, his voice steady as bedrock beneath shifting sand. "But we run now." The man who had saved her life was called Chaveo, though she would not learn his name for several hours yet. In his native tongue, it meant spirit warrior. a title earned not through boastful claims, but through deeds that had become legend among both Apache bands and army posts throughout the territory. His story was written in scars, the long mark across his collarbone from a mescalero ambush 3 winters past, smaller cuts on his hands, from countless encounters with hostile terrain and deeper wounds invisible to the casual observer. Chaveo had once believed in the possibility of peace between his people, and the endless stream of whites who poured into Apache lands like water through a broken dam. He had served as a scout for army supply trains guiding blue-coated soldiers through mountain passes, where a single misstep meant death on rocks hundreds of feet below. The pay had helped feed his family during harsh winters when game grew scarce and traditional hunting grounds lay under military patrol. But faith in cooperation had died with his wife and infant son during a cholera outbreak at the San Carlos Reservation, where government promises of medical care had proved as empty as rain barrels in August. Standing beside 2 shallow graves in ground too hard for proper burial, Chaveo had made a choice that would define the remainder of his life. He would help those who treated his people with dignity, but he would never again trust institutional authority to protect the innocent. My wife was called Morning Star, he told Elise as he cleaned her wounds with water from his canteen, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. She believed, as I did, that our children could learn the white man's ways while keeping Apache wisdom in their hearts. The reservation school promised such things. His hand stilled for a moment as memory transported him across the years of loss. When the sickness came, they had no medicine. Said Indian children must wait for white children to be treated first. My son lived 3 days. My wife followed him on the 4th. Elise saw the shadow that passed over his features, not self-pity, but the kind of pain that hardened into purpose. That's why you helped me. You couldn't save them. I save who I can now, he replied simply. The medicine man says our spirits are connected across all tribes, all colors. Pain inflicted on one touches all others. Your pain, your sister's pain, it becomes mine if I do nothing. 3 months before fate brought them together, Elise had arrived in Willow Springs carrying little beyond a letter of introduction to the freight post's kitchen and hopes that proved as fragile as spider webs in a desert wind. The town itself embodied frontier pragmatism over beauty-weathered clapboard buildings arranged along a single main street, where dust devils danced between hitching posts and water troughs perpetually stained red by iron-rich soil. Dr. Edwin Marcel's clinic occupied a modest structure at the town's eastern edge, its covered porch providing the only shade for blocks in any direction. The physician himself was a man whose gray eyes had seen too much suffering to retain illusions about human nature, yet whose hands remained steady when applying bandages to wounds that proper law enforcement should have prevented. Conrad Dietrich ruled Willow Springs through a combination of economic necessity and carefully calibrated violence. His freight operation handled legitimate cargo supplies for distant mining camps, manufactured goods for isolated ranches, mail that connected scattered settlements to the larger world. But these honest transactions merely provided cover for more profitable enterprises that thrived in the shadows between law and lawlessness. Sheriff Robert Klaus provided the legal foundation for Dietrich's empire, his badge lending official sanction to activities that would have been crimes in more civilized jurisdictions. Klaus had arrived in the territory 5 years earlier, carrying credentials that looked authentic enough to satisfy territorial authorities more concerned with filling positions than verifying qualifications. His clean-shaven face and well-tailored clothes projected respectability, while his willingness to look the other way when money changed hands had made him wealthy beyond any honest lawman's dreams. The system worked because everyone understood their role. Teamsters hauled cargo without asking awkward questions about manifests that didn't match their loads. Merchants accepted goods at prices that left generous margins without inquiring about their origins. Townspeople minded their own business and left law enforcement to properly appointed authorities. Until Elise began asking questions. Her European education had taught her to read and write, with a fluency that was remarkable on the frontier, where literacy often extended no further than signing one's name with painful deliberation. More dangerously, her upbringing had instilled moral principles that refused to bend before expedience or intimidation. She noticed discrepancies between cargo manifests and actual deliveries payments made to men who performed no visible work supplies that arrived damaged and were sold at full price to unsuspecting buyers. But it was her friendship with Emmett Walsh that transformed observation into action. Emmett was a teamster, whose weathered hands and permanent squint spoke of decades spent guiding wagon trains across terrain that seemed designed to kill both man and beast. Unlike most men who worked for Dietrich, Emmett possessed both conscience and courage, dangerous qualities in an environment where survival often depended on selective blindness. When Elise first arrived in Willow Springs, nervous and obviously out of place among the rough frontier crowd, Emmett had been the only person to offer genuine kindness. He shared his meals when her cooking wages proved insufficient, defended her from crude comments made by other workers, and treated her with the respect due any decent human being trying to make an honest living in a dishonest world. That kindness cost him dearly. It was a Tuesday morning when Elise witnessed the beating that would change everything. She had been carrying coffee to workers behind the freight house when raised voices drew her attention to a confrontation between Emmett and Greasy Pete Dietrich's deputy foreman, a man whose nickname derived from his perpetually unwashed hair and habit of wiping greasy hands on his pants rather than using proper rags. The manifest says 50 cases of ammunition bound for Fort Whipple. Emmett was saying his voice tight with controlled anger. But we only delivered 37. Where did the other 13 cases go? Pete's response was swift and brutal. The pistol whipping that followed left Emmett unconscious in the dust blood streaming from his scalp, while Pete and 2 other men stood over him laughing at their victim's concern for honesty in a world that rewarded only expedience. When Dr. Marcel arrived to tend Emmett's wounds, Pete made it clear that further questions about missing cargo would result in more of the same treatment or worse. The message was received and understood by every witness. Curiosity about Dietrich's business practices was hazardous to one's health. That night, as Elise helped Dr. Marcel clean Emmett's wounds in the clinic, she made a decision that would transform her from observer into participant in events that would shake the territory's foundations. The doctor worked in silence, his skilled hands gentle despite the anger that radiated from him like heat from a forge. Emmett drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling apologies for causing trouble. "He's a good man," Dr. Marcel said quietly as he applied the final bandage. "One of the few left in this town who still remembers what decency looks like." "What can we do?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor's gray eyes met hers with a look that spoke of years spent treating injuries he couldn't report and witnessing injustices he couldn't prevent. "Nothing," he said with bitter honesty. "Not unless we had proof that couldn't be ignored or destroyed." Proof. The word echoed in Elise's mind as she walked back to her small room behind the freight house kitchen, where thin walls provided little privacy and less security. She thought of Emmett's kindness, of other workers, who lived in fear of asking questions of families throughout the territory, who paid inflated prices for goods that had been stolen from government stores they helped support with their taxes. Somewhere in Dietrich's office, she was certain, lay the evidence needed to bring his entire operation crashing down. The challenge would be obtaining it without ending up like Emmett or worse. The opportunity came 3 days later when Dietrich celebrated a particularly profitable cattle transaction by getting thoroughly drunk at Murphy's Saloon. Elise had been cleaning the kitchen when she heard him stumble into his office, cursing as he fumbled with the combination to his safe. Through the thin wall that separated her quarters from his domain, she could hear metallic clicks as the lock opened, followed by the sound of money being counted and papers being shuffled. When Dietrich's snores began echoing through the building an hour later, Elise made the decision that would transform her from kitchen worker into fugitive. The office door stood unlocked, a carelessness born of arrogance and whiskey that would prove fatal to his carefully constructed empire. Dietrich lay slumped over his desk like a broken marionette, an empty bottle at his elbow and the safe standing open behind him, like a mouth waiting to reveal its secrets. Inside, stacks of bills shared space with official-looking documents, but it was the leather-bound ledger that drew her attention with magnetic intensity. The entries were written in Dietrich's own hand, a mixture of German phrases and frontier slang that created a code designed to confuse casual observers. Even so, certain patterns emerged with disturbing clarity payments to K for maintaining order, deliveries that existed on paper, but not in reality, and transactions that involved human cargo alongside more conventional goods. One entry made her blood turn to ice. N guardianship papers filed placement arranged transport to Silver City pending final payment. And could only be Nellie, her 10-year-old sister, who had been placed in temporary care when their aunt died during the journey west. Elise had been promised that Nellie would be kept safe until she could earn enough money to support them both. Instead, it appeared that Dietrich had filed legal papers to become her guardian, with plans to sell her into what the ledger euphemistically called domestic service in distant territories, where questions were rarely asked. With trembling hands, Elise closed the ledger and slipped it into the canvas satchel she had brought for this purpose. She also took several loose papers that appeared to be correspondence with buyers in other territories, evidence that would help decode the ledger's cryptic entries and reveal the full scope of the trafficking operation. As she prepared to leave, Dietrich stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about troublesome women and permanent solutions. His hand fell to rest on the butt of his revolver, the gesture automatic even in unconsciousness. The message was clear enough when he discovered the theft violence would follow swiftly and without mercy. Elise slipped from the office like a ghost, her soft shoes making no sound on wooden floors that creaked under the weight of ordinary footsteps. Within minutes, she had saddled Rosie and was riding hard toward Dr. Marcel's clinic, the stolen ledger pressed against her chest like armor against the darkness she had uncovered. But Dietrich's network proved more extensive than she had realized. By the time she reached the edge of town, riders were already mounting up behind her, their shouts carrying clearly across the desert air. Someone had been watching, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to present itself. The hunt had begun, and she was the prey in a game where stakes were measured in human lives. The abandoned homestead where Chaveo brought her stood as testament to dreams that had withered under the territory's harsh realities. Sun-bleached boards formed walls that still held together despite years of neglect, while a broken wagon wheel leaned against the porch like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and a cottonwood tree provided blessed shade in one corner of what had once been a carefully tended yard. As Chaveo cleaned her wounds with precious water from his canteen, Elise studied his face in the fading light and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since he appeared like salvation from empty air. "Why did you help me? You could have kept riding and stayed safe." Chaveo paused in his work, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. The scar across his collarbone seemed to pulse with old pain as memory transported him across years of loss and learning. "My grandfather told me once that we choose our battles not by their size, but by their meaning," he said finally. "I saw Dietrich chasing a woman across the prairie, saw him draw iron on someone who could not fight back. Such men deserve no consideration from any warrior worthy of the name. He resumed his work, wrapping clean cloth around her forearm with practiced efficiency. You are the cook at the freight house. Word travels quickly in small places, and some words carry the weight of truth. Emmett Walsh speaks well of you. Says you are one of the few whites who treats working men with respect. Emmett. Elise whispered, guilt washing over her as she realized her actions might have put her friend in even greater danger. Is he all right? He heals, Chaveo replied. Dr. Marcel tends his wounds, but deeper injuries take longer to mend. Emmett knows you took something important from Dietrich's safe. Says it was worth the risk if it stops what's happening to children in this territory. The validation from her friend provided strength she desperately needed, but it also carried the weight of enormous responsibility. If she failed to expose Dietrich's crimes, Emmett's suffering would have been for nothing, and worse consequences would follow for everyone who had shown her kindness. That ledger contains proof of what he's been doing. She said, her voice gaining strength as purpose crystallized in her mind. Stealing from the army, selling government supplies, taking bribes from rustlers, and worse things. Much worse. Tell me about these worse things. The story came out in halting pieces, her sister's placement in care, the guardianship papers Dietrich had filed, the payments listed in the ledger that suggested human trafficking disguised as legal apprenticeships. As she spoke, Chaveo's expression grew progressively darker, though his voice remained calm when he finally responded. My people know about such things, he said with quiet fury. Children taken from families sold to work in mines or houses where no child should be. The law allows it if the papers are signed correctly and the right officials receive proper compensation. He stood and moved to his horse, returning with a Winchester rifle and a leather pouch containing ammunition. This Dr. Marcel, he can be trusted with dangerous knowledge. Yes, Elise said without hesitation. He's treated half the territory, never asks questions about how people got hurt, never turns away someone who needs help. If anyone can get this evidence to honest authorities, it's him. Nirak, then we go to him, Chaveo decided. But we go carefully. Dietrich has eyes and ears throughout this town, and desperate men make dangerous enemies. The journey to Dr. Marcel's clinic required careful navigation through Willow Springs' network of back alleys and forgotten paths. Chaveo knew the town's layout better than most residents, having traded with the doctor for herbs and medical supplies over the past year, while avoiding the kind of attention that could prove hazardous to an Apache living outside reservation boundaries. They avoided the main street, entirely slipping between buildings like shadows cast by a moving moon. Behind them, the sounds of searching riders grew closer, men with lanterns checking every hiding place, every possible escape route, every building where fugitives might seek shelter. The clinic's single window glowed warmly in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a town where such commodities were increasingly rare. Dr. Marcel answered their knock immediately, as if he had been expecting visitors. His gray eyes took in Elise's torn dress and bandaged arms before settling on Chaveo with recognition and something that might have been relief. I heard shooting, the doctor said, ushering them inside quickly. And riders searching the streets with lanterns. What's happened? Elise placed the canvas satchel on Marcel's examination table with hands that still trembled from their narrow escape. I took this from Dietrich's safe. It contains proof of everything, the stolen goods, the bribes, the fake contracts. She hesitated, then added in a voice barely above a whisper, and evidence that he's been trafficking children through fraudulent guardianship claims. Dr. Marcel's face went pale as he opened the ledger and began examining its contents with the careful attention to detail that his medical training had ingrained. After several minutes of silent study, he looked up with an expression that mixed horror with grim determination. "There's enough evidence here to destroy his operation completely and implicate officials throughout the territorial government," Marcel said. "But we'll need to get this information to federal authorities immediately. Territorial law enforcement is too compromised to be trusted with something this explosive. The telegraph office can reach Fort Apache within hours," Chaveo pointed out. "If the message gets through." Dr. Marcel moved to his desk and began drafting a telegram, with careful precision, his medical training serving him well as he distilled complex information into concise, actionable intelligence. Claude Whitmore is an honest man who's grown tired of looking the other way when injustice parades as law. If we can get this message to him, he'll send it, even if it costs him his position. But even as they worked to expose Dietrich's crimes, the sounds of approaching danger grew louder. Multiple men were moving through the streets with purpose, rather than the random wandering of late-night revelers, their voices carrying the authority of those accustomed to being obeyed without question. The hunt was closing in, and time was running out faster than water poured into desert sand. The clinic's front window exploded inward as Greasy Pete drove his rifle butt through the glass with savage satisfaction, sending shards cascading across the floor like deadly rain. Behind him, 2 more men crowded through the doorway, with weapons drawn and faces twisted by anticipation of violence that had been too long delayed. "Evening, Doc," Pete said with mock courtesy as he stepped through the ruined window frame boots crunching on broken glass. "Heard you might be harboring some stolen property. Mind if we take a look around?" Dr. Marcel stepped protectively in front of his medical chest, where the ledger now lay hidden among bottles and instruments, his gray hair catching lamplight like silver wire. Despite his age and the obvious danger, his voice remained steady with the dignity of a man who had spent his life healing rather than harming. "This is a place of healing," he said quietly. "I won't have it violated by thieves and murderers masquerading as lawmen." Pete's response was a backhand blow that sent the older man stumbling against his examination table, blood streaming from his split lip. "Mouthy old fool," the foreman snarled. "Should have minded your own business like everyone else in this godforsaken town." Chaveo's Winchester appeared in his hands as if materialized by will alone. The weapon trained on Pete's chest with the rock-steady precision of someone who had learned to shoot when missing meant death. "Step away from him," he said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded deadly violence. The standoff stretched across several heartbeats, 6 armed men facing 1 Apache scout and an injured doctor in a room lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with medical supplies. Then, Elise moved slipping toward the clinic's back door with Dr. Marcel's carefully drafted telegram clutched in her hand, her movement breaking the spell that had frozen everyone in place. Gunfire erupted in the confined space, with deafening intensity muzzle flashes strobing like lightning as men sought cover behind overturned furniture and medical equipment. Chaveo's first shot took one of Pete's men in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor with metallic violence. A slug caught Chaveo's left ear, the near miss drawing blood, and sending him diving behind an overturned cabinet as splinters exploded from the wall where his head had been moments before. Another bullet punched through the clinic's door, embedding itself in the wooden frame with a sound like an axe striking seasoned oak. The back, Chaveo shouted over the gunfire, his voice barely audible above the chaos of violence in an enclosed space. "Go now." Elise needed no further encouragement. She slipped through the rear door as the battle raged behind her. The telegraph message pressed against her chest like a talisman against the darkness that seemed to be closing in from all sides. Behind her, the sounds of violence, continued shouts, gunshots, and the crash of furniture being reduced to splinters and kindling. The telegraph office lay 3 blocks away, across streets that might as well have been enemy territory patrolled by hostile forces. But with Chaveo and Dr. Marcel holding off Dietrich's men at the cost of their own safety, she had no choice but to run and hope that speed would serve her better than caution in a world where neither virtue was guaranteed to prevail. Claude Whitmore had operated the telegraph office for 7 years, long enough to know that some messages carried more weight than the sum of their words. When Elise burst through his door in the pre-dawn darkness, her dress torn and blood staining her sleeves like badges of desperate courage, he took one look at the determination in her eyes and began preparing his equipment without asking questions that might waste precious time. The message she handed him was written in Dr. Marcel's careful script. Urgent Fort Apache stop evidence, major fraud theft, government supplies. Stop civilian kidnapping documented, stop send assistance, Willow Springs, immediately, stop Marcel. Claude's weathered fingers moved across the telegraph key with practiced precision, born of years spent connecting isolated communities to the larger world. The dots and dashes of Morse code crackling through copper wire toward distant salvation. Each click seemed to echo in the small office, like the ticking of a clock, counting down to either justice or catastrophe. Message sent, Claude announced as he completed the transmission, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Fort Apache acknowledged receipt and promised immediate response. Should have cavalry riding within the hour. But their moment of triumph was shattered by the crash of splintering wood as someone kicked in the front door with enough force to tear it from its hinges. Greasy Pete stood framed in the doorway, his face streaked with soot and his eyes wild with the kind of violence that came from desperation and proximity to failure. "Well, well," Pete said with savage satisfaction as he surveyed the scene before him. Little Birdie finally flew back to her nest, and she's brought the wire puller with her. Behind him, 2 more men crowded into the small space, their weapons trained on the telegraph operator, and the young woman who had caused so much trouble for their employer's carefully constructed empire. The smell of coal oil and burning rags drifted through the doorway, suggesting that fire would soon join bullets as tools of intimidation. Chaveo appeared behind the men, like death materializing from shadow, his carbine stock connecting with the nearest gunman's skull, with a sound like a hammer striking anvil. The man dropped instantly, his weapon clattering across the wooden floor as his body followed with boneless finality. The second gunman spun around, trying to bring his rifle to bear on this new threat. But Chaveo's fist caught him flush on the jaw with enough force to lift him off his feet. The man crashed backward into a rack of telegraph equipment, sparks flying as delicate mechanisms were reduced to twisted metal and broken dreams. "Move." Chaveo barked, grabbing a heavy wooden plank from a stack of lumber and jamming it across the door brackets, just as more footsteps thundered up the walkway outside. "They'll try to burn us out." Pete raised his pistol toward Elise, murder plain in his eyes. But Claude surprised everyone by producing a sawed-off shotgun from beneath his telegraph desk. The weapon's twin barrels yawned like cave mouths in the lamplight, promising destruction to anyone foolish enough to test the operator's resolve. "I've been waiting 7 years for an excuse to use this," Claude said with grim satisfaction that spoke of accumulated grievances finally finding outlet. "Don't give me one." The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds before a flaming bottle crashed through the office's side window, spreading coal, oil, and fire across the wooden floor, with the hungry intensity of flame-meeting fuel. Smoke began filling the small space immediately, and the crackle of consuming wood joined the sounds of men shouting outside, as Dietrich's forces prepared for a siege that would end in either surrender or ashes. "Back door," Chaveo commanded, shouldering his way through smoke that burned their lungs and stung their eyes like tears of rage. They emerged into an alley, filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and the distant shouts of men organizing what had become a manhunt with military precision. The telegraph office was already beyond saving flames, licked hungrily at dry timber, sending sparks dancing into the star-filled sky like fireflies celebrating destruction. But the message had been sent carried across miles of copper wire to men who wore uniforms and remembered oaths about protecting the innocent from those who would prey upon them. Somewhere in the darkness, help was finally on the way, if they could survive long enough to receive it. By full daylight, Sheriff Klaus had positioned armed men at every road leading out of Willow Springs, transforming the town into a prison whose bars were formed by Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers. The official justification, announced to the gathered townspeople with all the solemnity of legitimate authority, was concern about dangerous criminals who threatened the community's safety and prosperity. Nobody leaves town without proper authorization. Klaus declared from the steps of his office, his clean-shaven face projecting the kind of confidence that came from holding all the high cards in a deadly game. These fugitives have stolen government property and endangered innocent lives. We'll maintain security until proper justice can be administered. But Klaus was playing a more sophisticated game than simple containment. As the morning progressed, he began implementing a strategy that would have impressed military tacticians for its combination of legal authority and psychological manipulation. Instead of simply hunting down the fugitives, he positioned himself as the voice of reasonable law enforcement offering to negotiate their peaceful surrender in exchange for considerations that sounded almost generous. I understand Miss Brennan may have acted from misguided concern for her sister. Klaus announced to a crowd gathered before the jail. If she surrenders the stolen materials and submits to proper legal processes, I'm prepared to recommend clemency. The territory has no interest in punishing those who've been led astray by others with more criminal intent. The offer was calculated to create doubt among potential supporters while providing Klaus with plausible cover for whatever actions he might need to take. If Elise surrendered, he could ensure her permanent silence while appearing to follow proper legal procedures. If she refused, he would have justification for using whatever force proved necessary to recover materials that threatened not just Dietrich's operation, but Klaus's own carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. Walter Morrison, the dry land farmer whose hands bore permanent cracks from alkali soil, recognized the sheriff's strategy for what it was, a trap disguised as mercy. Standing in his farmyard as Klaus's deputies questioned him about harboring fugitives, Walter made a decision that would transform him from neutral observer into active participant in events that would reshape the territory's power structure. "You want to search my property?" Walter asked, his voice carrying the kind of calm that came from making peace with necessary risks. "You'll need proper warrants signed by territorial judges, not local officials with questionable authority." The legal challenge caught Klaus off guard. Most frontier residents accepted sheriff's authority without question, lacking both education and resources to challenge official actions through proper channels. But Walter had homesteaded his land through legal processes that required familiarity with territorial law. And he understood exactly which powers belonged to local officials and which required higher authorization. "I don't need warrants to investigate reported crimes," Klaus replied, but uncertainty had crept into his voice as he realized his opponent possessed unexpected knowledge of legal procedures. "You need warrants to search private property without owner consent," Walter corrected with the confidence of someone who had studied territorial statutes during long winter evenings. "And you need evidence of specific crimes, not general suspicions about unspecified wrongdoing." The confrontation attracted attention from other townspeople who had gathered to watch Klaus's forces tighten their control over Willow Springs. Grace Hoffman, the schoolteacher, stepped forward with the kind of courage that came from spending years managing classrooms full of frontier children whose respect had to be earned rather than demanded. "Mr. Morrison is correct about warrant requirements," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I've taught territorial law as part of our civics curriculum, and local sheriffs have limited search authority without proper judicial authorization." Klaus found himself facing something he hadn't expected: organized resistance, based on legal knowledge rather than simple defiance. The situation was slipping beyond his control in ways that threatened to expose the careful balance of legitimate authority and criminal conspiracy that made his position possible. Meanwhile, in the foothills above town, Chaveo led Elise through terrain that tested both their endurance and their growing partnership. The slot canyon where they had taken shelter was barely wider than a man's outstretched arms, its walls carved smooth by countless flash floods that had scoured the rock over geological ages. "We can't stay hidden much longer," Chaveo said as he studied the surrounding ridges through careful eyes that missed nothing in landscapes where survival depended on constant vigilance. "Klaus will bring in tracking dogs, and our scent will lead them here before nightfall." But Elise was discovering resources within herself that European civilization had never required her to develop. The woman who had arrived in Willow Springs 3 months earlier, nervous, dependent, overwhelmed by frontier harshness, was being replaced by someone harder and more capable of surviving in a world where strength mattered more than refinement. "Then we don't hide," she said, her voice carrying new determination born of necessity and purpose. "We go on the offensive. Klaus expects us to run or surrender. We do neither." The plan that emerged from their discussion was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of fleeing toward uncertain safety or attempting to evade pursuit indefinitely, they would return to Willow Springs and force a confrontation that would expose Klaus's true allegiances before the entire community. Their first ally appeared in the form of Nidus, a 16-year-old Apache who moved through the Badlands with the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with hostile terrain. The boy brought news that transformed their understanding of the situation and provided resources they desperately needed. "Uncle Nidus," said in Apache before switching to English for Elise's benefit. "The town below is like a pot ready to boil over. The white sheriff has made enemies of people who were neutral before. They begin to ask questions about his authority. More importantly, Nidus carried intelligence about the broader scope of Klaus's operation that revealed why the sheriff was fighting so desperately to contain evidence of his crimes. The trafficking network extended far beyond Willow Springs, reaching into territorial government itself through carefully placed officials who provided legal cover for activities that would have been prosecuted as federal crimes in more honest jurisdictions. The woman Grace found more papers in the burned wirehouse, Nidus reported. Papers that name names of big men in territorial capital. She sends word that this reaches higher than anyone knew. The revelation transformed their mission from local law enforcement to something approaching a territorial scandal that could reshape power structures throughout Arizona. But it also meant their enemies possessed resources and motivations that went far beyond protecting a single criminal enterprise. "Klaus can't afford to let us live," Chaveo realized with grim certainty. "If this reaches federal authorities, everyone involved faces prison or hanging. Desperate men with nothing left to lose make the most dangerous enemies." As if summoned by his words, the sound of baying hounds drifted across the desert air like the voices of demons hunting souls. Klaus had indeed acquired tracking dogs, and time was running out faster than water poured into sand. The chase intensifies. They broke cover at sunset, when failing light would make accurate shooting difficult and approaching darkness might provide concealment from pursuit that had grown more organized and deadly with each passing hour. Chaveo had spent the afternoon studying terrain that would either provide salvation or become their grave mapping every gully and wash that might offer temporary shelter during their desperate run toward confrontation. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Reach the abandoned mine at Rattler's End, where intelligence suggested trafficked children were being held before transport to distant buyers. If they could rescue the captives and gather additional evidence, they might create enough leverage to force Klaus into mistakes that would expose his true nature. They had covered perhaps 3 miles of open ground when the first shots rang out behind them, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the gathering dusk. Klaus himself led the pursuit, his badge catching starlight as he leaned forward in his saddle with the intensity of a man whose future depended on eliminating threats to his carefully constructed empire. But the sheriff was playing a more sophisticated game than simple pursuit. Even as his men fired at the fleeing figures, Klaus was positioning forces to ensure that any escape route would lead his quarry exactly where he wanted them, into terrain where superior numbers could be brought to bear without witnesses to complicate subsequent explanations. Drive them toward Devil's Canyon. Klaus commanded his men as they spread out across the prairie in a formation designed to funnel their targets toward predetermined killing ground. We'll end this where nobody will ask awkward questions about what happened. The chase spread across short grass prairie under stars that provided enough light to reveal riders, but not enough to guarantee accurate shooting at distance. Chaveo guided his horse through mesquite and prickly pear, with the skill of someone who had learned to read terrain the way others read books, using every scrap of cover the landscape provided. Behind them, bullets whined through the air with the sound of angry hornets, some close enough that they could hear the distinctive crack of supersonic passage. But darkness was their ally now, making precision shooting nearly impossible while allowing them to change direction without being observed by pursuers who had to rely on sound and instinct. The limestone outcropping that saved their lives sat like a monument to geological forces that had pushed ancient seafloors toward the sky millions of years before human conflicts troubled the desert's peace. Chaveo threw himself from his horse and dragged Elise behind its protective bulk just as a volley of shots chipped stone fragments from its surface with the sound of hammers striking anvils. "Stay low," he commanded, leveling his Winchester and taking careful aim at muzzle flashes that revealed their attackers' positions with each shot fired. His first shot took a horse rather than its rider, sending both mount and man tumbling in a cloud of dust and thrashing limbs that temporarily disrupted the assault's momentum. His second shot missed its intended target, but came close enough to a rider's head that the man veered away, seeking his own cover among the scattered boulders that dotted the prairie like sleeping giants. But 6 men with rifles posed odds that even Apache training couldn't overcome indefinitely, especially when their ammunition was limited and their enemies possessed both patience and superior numbers. As bullets continued to hammer the boulder's surface, Chaveo knew they had perhaps minutes before the hunters worked around to flanking positions that would end the fight with brutal finality. It was Elise who spotted the dry wash, its edges hidden by tall grass, until approached closely enough to reveal the gap in earth carved by flash floods that visited this country with irregular but devastating frequency. "There," she shouted, pointing to what looked like solid ground, but was actually a channel that offered concealment and a path away from immediate danger. They ran for it as bullets kicked up dust around their feet, diving headfirst into the narrow channel, just as Klaus's men gained clear lines of fire that would have ended their flight permanently. The wash was perhaps 6 feet deep and barely wide enough for 2 people to move side by side, but it offered protection and a route away from superior firepower. They crawled through greasewood and sharp stones until their knees bled, following the meandering course of the wash as it wound toward distant objectives that remained hidden in darkness. Behind them, frustrated shouts and the sound of horses being repositioned suggested their escape had been noted, but not immediately countered by men accustomed to easier prey. The town's resistance grows. While the chase played out across the desert, Willow Springs itself became a different kind of battlefield, where the weapons were words and the ammunition was accumulated grievances that had finally found voice. The confrontation that would reshape the community's power structure began in Murphy's Saloon, where Klaus's deputies had been recruiting additional men with promises of easy money and generous applications of whiskey to loosen tongues and consciences. Any man willing to ride with proper law enforcement gets $10 silver, announced Dusty Bill Jenkins, one of Klaus's regular enforcers, who wore a deputy badge despite having no legitimate claim to law enforcement authority. Plus, a share of whatever bounty gets collected from those thieving varmints. Walter Morrison pushed through the batwing doors with determination written in every line of his weathered face. Archie MacDonald, the blacksmith, at his side like a force of nature, given human form. Both men were armed, Walter, with an old army Colt that had seen service in campaigns against Apache raiders, Archie with a hammer that had shaped iron for 20 years and could just as easily shape skulls if circumstances required such applications. We're here to tell you boys to think twice about that offer. Walter said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived Apache raids, drought, years, and the kind of hardships that separated survivors from statistics. Might be that Klaus's silver won't spend so well when federal authorities finish investigating his business practices. One-eyed Sam Crawford, another of Klaus's thugs masquerading as legitimate law enforcement, stepped forward with the swagger of a man who believed intimidation was his strongest weapon. The deputy badge pinned to his vest gleamed in the saloon's lamplight, though his claim to wear it rested on Klaus's word rather than any territorial authority. "You threatening duly appointed peace officers?" Sam demanded, his hand resting on his gun butt with theatrical menace designed to cow opponents who lacked experience with frontier violence. "I'm stating facts that any honest man can verify," Walter replied with the calm confidence of someone who had made peace with necessary risks. "That young woman you're hunting has evidence that'll hang the lot of you when proper authorities review it. Smart man would be thinking about changing sides before it's too late for clemency." The fight that erupted required no further provocation. One-eyed Sam swung a bottle at Walter's head with vicious intent, but the farmer ducked with reflexes honed by years of avoiding both Apache arrows and territorial politics. Walter's return punch caught Sam in the solar plexus with enough force to double him over, while Archie's hammer intercepted Dusty Bill's reaching hand with a satisfying crunch of small bones breaking. The saloon dissolved into chaos as other patrons chose sides or simply fought for the joy of expressing frustrations that had accumulated through months of watching Klaus's men abuse their authority without consequence. Chairs splintered against skulls while men rolled across sawdust floors, trading punches and kicks with desperate intensity born of grievances finally finding outlet. The bartender cowered behind his counter as bottles exploded against walls and mirrors shattered under the impact of thrown objects that transformed his establishment into a battlefield where the stakes were measured in community control rather than simple personal grudges. Klaus arrived with additional deputies, all wearing carefully neutral expressions that masked their understanding of which side would ultimately determine their employment prospects. "Enough!" the sheriff shouted, firing his pistol into the ceiling to get everyone's attention while simultaneously demonstrating his willingness to use force against anyone who challenged his authority. "Walter Morrison, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace and assaulting duly appointed officers of the territorial government," Klaus announced with the kind of legal formality that provided cover for actions that might later require justification to higher authorities. But as they dragged Walter away in handcuffs, Grace Hoffman appeared with a basket containing bread and clean water. A kindness that was tolerated because it saved the county money on feeding costs while maintaining her cover as a concerned citizen, rather than an active participant in resistance activities. The wire message got through, she whispered as she handed Walter the bread, her voice barely audible above the sounds of men being treated for injuries sustained in the brawl. Claude hid a copy before his office burned, and there's more. Army cavalry left Fort Apache this morning. Should be here within 2 days if they push hard. The news provided hope, but Walter understood that help might arrive too late to save either the fugitives or the children whose lives hung in the balance of events spiraling beyond anyone's control. Somewhere in the Badlands, innocence depended on the courage of ordinary people to stand against evil that wore badges and spoke with legal authority. The question was whether that courage would prove sufficient when the final accounting demanded payment in blood. The abandoned silver mine at Rattler's End squatted against red rock formations like a wound in the earth that had never properly healed. Rusted equipment lay scattered around the site. Broken ore carts, corroded cables, and the skeletal remains of machinery that had once processed cinnabar ores into mercury for distant industrial applications. Now the mine served a different purpose entirely, one that filled the desert air with sounds that no natural place should contain. Chaveo, Elise, and Nidus approached the site in pre-dawn darkness, their movements careful and deliberate, as they navigated terrain littered with unstable shafts and concealed dangers that could swallow unwary travelers without warning. The Apache scout's wounded shoulder had stiffened during the cold night, forcing him to carry his rifle awkwardly, while his left arm remained strapped against his chest to prevent further injury. 4 guards, Nidus whispered after completing reconnaissance that had taken him dangerously close to men who would shoot first and never bother with questions. 2 at the main entrance, 2 more watching the children they keep in modified tunnels. From their position on the rocky slope above the mine, they could see crude barriers that had transformed abandoned workings into holding pens for human cargo. Wooden slat fences stretched across tunnel mouths, creating cage-like enclosures where shadowy figures huddled in darkness that seemed to swallow hope as completely as it did light. The sound of children's voices, muffled by stone and distance, drifted up from the depths, like prayers offered to deaf gods. But it was what Nidus discovered during his scouting that transformed their understanding of the situation from rescue mission into something far more complex and dangerous. Hidden among the mine's equipment, partially concealed by canvas tarps, sat a collection of official documents that revealed the true scope of Klaus's operation. These papers, Nidus set his young face grave, with knowledge that should never burden someone his age. They show this reaches all the way to territorial capital. Names I recognize from government announcements, judges, and officials who make laws for whole territory. The documents were correspondence between Klaus and Territorial Judge Harrison Webb, a man whose reputation for integrity had made him wealthy through carefully hidden connections to criminal enterprises throughout Arizona. The letters detailed a system that went far beyond simple corruption. It was systematic exploitation of territorial law to create legal cover for activities that would have been prosecuted as federal crimes in jurisdictions with honest oversight. Look at this, Elise whispered, her voice barely audible, as she studied a letter that made her blood run cold. Webb has been filing guardianship orders for dozens of children throughout the territory. Not just orphans, but children whose parents have been arrested on fabricated charges or killed in incidents that were arranged to look like accidents. The revelation was staggering in its implications. What they had assumed was opportunistic trafficking of parentless children was actually systematic murder and kidnapping disguised as legal child welfare procedures. Families were being destroyed to create merchandise with territorial law, providing the framework for crimes that reached into every corner of Arizona's government. But the most devastating discovery came in Klaus's own handwriting, a report to Judge Webb that detailed their current situation with clinical precision. Brennan woman and Apache accomplice have acquired ledger evidence, but remain at large. Recommend immediate implementation of contingency protocols. Suggest territorial inspection be postponed indefinitely due to security concerns in affected regions. The letter was dated that very morning, meaning Klaus had been in communication with his superior throughout their flight. More chilling still was Webb's response delivered by express messenger: protocols authorized. Eliminate all witnesses and evidence. Will provide legal justification for whatever actions prove necessary. Territorial authority supersedes federal jurisdiction in matters of local security. We're not just fighting Klaus and Dietrich. Chaveo realized with grim certainty as the full scope of their enemies became clear. We're fighting the entire territorial government. They have legal authority to do whatever they want, and federal help may never come if they claim jurisdiction over local law enforcement matters. The twist deepened when they discovered that Judge Webb had already filed papers with federal authorities claiming that Willow Springs was experiencing an Apache uprising that required territorial military intervention. The story painted Chaveo as a renegade warrior leading raids against peaceful settlers, while Elise was described as a captive forced to assist hostile actions against territorial authority. They're going to kill us all and claim it was necessary to suppress Indian violence. Elise said, her voice hollow with the realization that escape might be impossible when their enemies controlled both law enforcement and legal justification for their actions. No one will question it, because it fits what people expect to hear about Apache conflicts. The sophisticated nature of their enemy's strategy was breathtaking in its cynical effectiveness. By framing their actions as response to Indian aggression, Klaus and Webb could eliminate witnesses while appearing to fulfill their sworn duties as territorial officials. Any evidence of trafficking could be destroyed as security measures, while the deaths of inconvenient opponents would be recorded as casualties sustained during lawful suppression of hostile activities. But Nidus brought news that provided a glimmer of hope amid the darkness that seemed to be closing around them from all sides. His scouting had revealed that not all of Klaus's men were willing participants in activities that crossed lines even hardened frontier criminals respected. Some of the guards they talk about wanting out, the young Apache reported. They signed on to chase rustlers and keep order in town. Nobody told them they'd be guarding children sold like cattle or killing people who asked too many questions. The dissension within Klaus's ranks suggested an opportunity for psychological warfare that might prove more effective than direct assault against superior numbers. If they could create enough doubt among the rank-and-file deputies, the sheriff's authority might crumble from within as subordinates refused orders that violated their own moral boundaries. Klaus maintains control through fear and money. Chaveo observed as he studied the mine's defenses with tactical eyes trained by years of scouting for military forces. Remove either one, and his men will start making different choices about which orders to follow. The plan that emerged was audacious in its complexity and terrifying in its implications for everyone involved. Instead of attempting to rescue Nellie and the other children through stealth, they would stage a public confrontation that forced Klaus to reveal his true nature before witnesses who couldn't be silenced or discredited through territorial authority. We make him choose between maintaining his cover as legitimate law enforcement or protecting his criminal enterprise. Elise said, her voice gaining strength as strategy crystallized in her mind. Either choice destroys him, but only if we survive long enough to force the decision. The approaching dawn brought with it the sound of riders moving through the Badlands. With military precision, Klaus's forces reinforced by territorial militia, that Judge Webb had dispatched to ensure that threats to their operation were eliminated permanently. The hunt was entering its final phase, and the stakes had escalated beyond simple survival to encompass justice for an entire territory. As they prepared to abandon their hiding place and move toward confrontation that would determine the fate of dozens of trafficked children, Elise found herself thinking about courage and its many forms. Some bravery was obvious, charging into battle with weapons blazing and war cries echoing across empty spaces. But other kinds were quieter and perhaps more important, the courage to do what was right when easier paths lay open to protect innocence, when cynicism provided better odds of personal survival. Around her, 2 Apache warriors prepared to risk everything for principles that transcended tribal loyalties or personal safety. Their commitment gave her strength to face dangers that would have terrified the woman she had been 3 months earlier, before Arizona territory had burned away everything soft in her character and left only what was strong enough to endure. The sun climbed toward its zenith as they made final preparations for actions that would either bring justice to a corrupted system or add their names to the long list of those who had tried and failed to stand against overwhelming power. But failure was a luxury they couldn't afford. Too many innocent lives depended on their success for surrender to remain an option. The attack on the mine came with the brutal efficiency of men who had grown tired of subtle approaches and patient stalking. Klaus led the assault personally, his badge gleaming in the morning sunlight, as he positioned his forces around the abandoned workings with military precision that spoke of careful planning and overwhelming confidence in the outcome. Surrender now and face territorial justice. Klaus called out, his voice echoing off stone formations that had witnessed countless acts of violence throughout their geological existence. Continue this resistance and face the consequences of defying lawful authority in time of territorial emergency. But the sheriff's offer of mercy was undermined by the actions of his men, who had already begun positioning themselves for a massacre that would eliminate witnesses along with their primary targets. Territorial militiamen spread out among the rocks with the casual efficiency of professionals who understood that official authority could justify any level of violence deemed necessary for public safety. Chaveo recognized the tactical situation with the clarity of someone who had survived similar encounters through combinations of skill, luck, and willingness to accept casualties that more cautious opponents couldn't tolerate. "They're not planning to take prisoners," he told his companions as he checked his Winchester's action with methodical care. "Klaus can't afford to let any of us live to testify about what we've seen." The first shots came from unexpected directions as Klaus's men revealed positions they had occupied during the night, turning what appeared to be defensive terrain into a carefully prepared killing ground. Bullets whined off stone surfaces and kicked up sprays of dust and rock fragments that stung exposed skin and filled the air with choking clouds. But it was during this initial exchange of gunfire that disaster struck from an entirely different source. A stray bullet fired by one of the territorial militiamen who lacked experience with precision shooting in confined spaces struck a support beam that had been holding back tons of loose rock and mining debris for decades. The avalanche that followed was brief but devastating, separating Chaveo from his companions and trapping Nidus beneath a pile of stones that threatened to crush the life from his young body. Worse still, the rockfall had blocked their primary escape route while creating new defensive positions for Klaus's forces to exploit. "Nidus!" Elise cried out, scrambling toward the rock pile despite bullets that continued to whine through the air around her position. The Apache boy was conscious, but pinned beneath stones too heavy for her to move alone. His face pale with pain and the shock of impact that had driven the breath from his lungs. Chaveo fought his way through the chaos of continued gunfire and settling dust, his wounded shoulders screaming with fresh agony as he hauled stones aside with desperate strength. Each boulder removed revealed more debris beneath, creating a deadly race against time as Klaus's men closed in from multiple directions. "Leave me." Nidus gasped through gritted teeth as blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where falling stone had grazed his skull. "Get the children out. That's what matters now." But neither Chaveo nor Elise was willing to abandon someone who had risked everything to help them expose Klaus's crimes. Working together, despite the continuing danger, they managed to clear enough debris to pull the injured boy free. Though his right leg hung at an awkward angle that suggested broken bones that would require medical attention they couldn't provide in their current circumstances. The rescue cost them precious time and ammunition, as Klaus's forces used the distraction to advance closer to positions that would make further resistance impossible. When the dust finally settled, they found themselves trapped in a narrow section of the mine with limited ammunition and a seriously injured companion who couldn't travel without assistance. "We need a new plan," Elise said with admirable understatement as she surveyed their deteriorating tactical situation. Around them, the sounds of approaching boots on stone suggested that Klaus was preparing for a final assault that would end their resistance permanently. It was then that salvation appeared from an entirely unexpected source. Dr. Marcel's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the mine, calling out with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in medical emergencies. "Sheriff Klaus." The doctor shouted his words, carrying clearly through tunnels that amplified sound in strange ways. "I'm here in my capacity as Territorial Health Inspector, investigating reports of child endangerment in violation of federal statutes. Cease hostile actions immediately and submit to proper legal review of your activities." The bluff was audacious in its boldness and brilliant in its psychological impact on men who had grown accustomed to using legal authority as justification for their actions. Klaus found himself facing someone who claimed even higher legal standing, creating doubt about whether his orders would protect subordinates from later prosecution. "Dr. Marcel has no authority here." Klaus called back, but uncertainty had crept into his voice as he realized that killing a respected physician might prove more difficult to justify than eliminating suspected criminals. "This is a law enforcement matter involving armed resistance to territorial authority." "Armed resistance by whom?" Marcel replied with the kind of precision that came from years of presenting medical testimony in legal proceedings. "I see wounded children being held against their will in conditions that violate territorial health codes. I see armed men threatening a licensed physician, attempting to provide medical care to minors in distress." The exchange revealed the careful balance that Klaus had to maintain between eliminating threats and avoiding actions that would attract unwanted federal attention to his activities. Dr. Marcel's presence complicated everything by providing witness testimony from someone whose professional reputation would be difficult to discredit through territorial channels. But Klaus was too deeply committed to his course of action to allow legal technicalities to interfere with operational necessities. "Dr. Marcel, you are interfering with official investigation of criminal activities," he announced with renewed confidence. "Stand down immediately or face arrest as an accessory to crimes against territorial security." The sheriff's response revealed his true intentions. He was prepared to kill anyone who threatened his operation, regardless of their professional standing or legal authority. Dr. Marcel's bluff had bought them time, but it hadn't changed the fundamental reality that they were outnumbered and outgunned by men who controlled official justification for their actions. "He's going to kill us all," Elise realized with crystalline clarity as she listened to Klaus organizing his men for what would obviously be a final assault. The doctor, the children, everyone who knows what they've been doing. Chaveo nodded grimly as he checked his remaining ammunition and found the count disturbingly low. Klaus has crossed too many lines to turn back now. But that also makes him desperate, and desperate men make mistakes that careful men avoid. The mistake came sooner than expected, delivered by Klaus himself, as his patience finally snapped under the pressure of maintaining legal pretenses while conducting what amounted to mass murder. To hell with territorial protocols, he snarled loud enough for everyone to hear. Kill them all and burn the bodies. We'll claim they died resisting arrest during Indian uprising. The words carried clearly through the mine's acoustic properties, reaching not only his intended targets, but also his own men who had been told they were participating in legitimate law enforcement activities. The naked admission of planned murder and evidence destruction created exactly the kind of moral crisis that Chaveo had hoped to exploit among Klaus's subordinates. You hear that, boys? Called out Tom Hendricks, a deputy who had signed on to chase rustlers rather than murder children. Sheriff's talking about killing a doctor and burning witnesses. That's not law enforcement, that's wholesale butchery. Shut up, Hendricks. Klaus commanded, but his authority was crumbling as other deputies began questioning orders that crossed lines even hardened frontier criminals respected. You'll follow orders or face charges of insubordination in time of territorial emergency. But the damage was done. Klaus's mask of legal authority had slipped, completely revealing the criminal underneath in ways that made further cooperation impossible for men who retained any shred of conscience or concern for their own legal standing. The mutiny that followed was swift and decisive, as nearly half of Klaus's force laid down their weapons rather than participate in actions that would make them accessories to crimes that could result in federal prosecution. The sheriff found himself facing his enemies with dramatically reduced numbers and subordinates whose loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. Last chance. Klaus called out, his voice now carrying the desperation of a man who saw his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. Surrender the evidence and submit to territorial justice, or face the consequences of continued resistance. And come take it. Chaveo replied with the kind of calm that preceded deadly violence. The final battle was about to begin, and both sides understood that only one would survive to tell the story of what had happened in the abandoned mine at Rattler's End. The final assault began with Klaus leading a reduced but still formidable force into the mine's depths, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed decades of honest labor before becoming the setting for wholesale criminality. The sheriff had abandoned all pretense of legal authority, revealing himself as nothing more than a well-armed criminal whose badge provided no more legitimacy than a robber's mask. Burn them out. Klaus commanded his remaining loyal men, his voice echoing through tunnels that amplified sound in ways that made whispers seem like shouts. Use the coal oil from the equipment shed. We'll claim they died in an accidental fire during arrest procedures. But Dr. Marcel had spent the crucial minutes during Klaus's approach treating the injured children they had discovered in the mine's converted holding areas, and his medical assessment revealed horrors that went beyond simple kidnapping. Several of the youngest victims bore signs of systematic abuse, while others showed symptoms of deliberate starvation designed to make them more compliant during transport to distant buyers. These children have been tortured, Dr. Marcel announced with the clinical precision of someone documenting evidence for future legal proceedings. Systematic deprivation, physical abuse, and psychological trauma consistent with human trafficking operations. This constitutes crimes against federal statutes governing interstate commerce in human beings. His words carried clearly through the mine's acoustic properties, reaching not only Klaus and his men, but also the remaining deputies who had begun to understand the true scope of what they had been supporting through their obedience to corrupted authority. Elise used the distraction of Dr. Marcel's testimony to position herself behind mining equipment that provided both cover and a clear field of fire toward the main tunnel entrance. Chaveo's patient instruction during their flight had transformed her from someone who had never handled firearms into a marksman capable of placing shots with deadly precision when necessity demanded such skills. The Winchester felt steady in her hands, now its weight and balance familiar rather than frightening. As she sighted on lantern flames that revealed her enemy's positions, with each step they took deeper into the mine. Her first shot extinguished the nearest light source, plunging that section of tunnel into darkness that would force Klaus's men to advance blind or retreat to reorganize their assault. "There!" Klaus shouted, pointing toward the muzzle flash that had revealed Elise's position. "Concentrate fire on that equipment pile." Bullets hammered the mining machinery around her, with the sound of hammers striking anvils, sending up showers of sparks and metal fragments that filled the air with the smell of hot iron and gunpowder. But the heavy equipment that had been designed to withstand the punishment of industrial mining operations proved capable of stopping rifle bullets, providing protection that allowed her to maintain her position despite the concentrated fire. Chaveo had positioned himself to exploit the mine's complex layout, using side tunnels and abandoned workings to appear and disappear like a ghost haunting Klaus's nightmares. His carbine spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed to disable rather than kill when possible, not from squeamishness, but from tactical calculation that wounded enemies required more resources to manage than dead ones. His first shot took Deputy Carson in the shoulder, spinning the man around and sending his rifle clattering across stone floors while he screamed about needing medical attention that wouldn't be available until the fighting ended. His second shot shattered the lantern that Greasy Pete was using to illuminate potential targets, leaving the foreman cursing in darkness that made accurate return fire nearly impossible. But it was Nidus who provided the most crucial intervention, despite his injuries limiting his mobility to careful movements that sent waves of pain through his damaged leg. The young Apache had discovered something during his earlier reconnaissance, a cache of mining explosives that previous operators had abandoned when the silver played out and operations became unprofitable. "Uncle," he called out in Apache, his voice barely audible above the gunfire that continued to echo through confined spaces. "The old powder magazine still has charges. If we can create confusion..." Chaveo understood immediately what his young kinsman was suggesting, though the risks involved made the proposal almost suicidal in its implications. Mining explosives from the 1870s were notoriously unstable, likely to detonate from rough handling or exposure to the kind of sparks that gunfire created in enclosed spaces. But desperate circumstances required desperate measures, and their ammunition was running dangerously low, while Klaus's forces still outnumbered them significantly. "Do it." Chaveo decided, his voice carrying the calm of someone who had made peace with necessary risks. "But carefully. Those charges have been aging in desert heat for years." The explosion, when it came, was more controlled than anyone had dared hope. Nidus had managed to position 2 small charges in side tunnels that would collapse without bringing down the main workings, creating barriers that would force Klaus's men into more confined spaces where superior numbers couldn't be brought to bear effectively. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth itself. Dust and debris filled the air with choking intensity, while the shock wave knocked men from their feet and sent lanterns tumbling across stone floors to shatter against walls. When the dust settled, Klaus found himself cut off from half his men by rockfalls that had transformed familiar tunnels into impassable barriers. Worse still, the explosion had revealed something that made his blood run cold, with implications he couldn't afford to contemplate. The sound of approaching hoofbeats that suggested cavalry forces were finally arriving from Fort Apache. The Captain Morrison, United States Army. came a commanding voice from the mine entrance, amplified by the same acoustic properties that had carried their battle sounds across the desert to alert military forces to the situation. Cease hostile actions immediately and prepare to be taken into custody for questioning regarding criminal activities under federal jurisdiction. Klaus realized with dawning horror that his carefully constructed fiction about Apache uprisings had backfired catastrophically. Instead of providing cover for eliminating witnesses, his reports had attracted exactly the kind of federal attention that his entire operation had been designed to avoid. "We're conducting legitimate law enforcement activities." Klaus shouted back, his voice cracking with the strain of maintaining lies that no longer served any useful purpose. "These are dangerous criminals who have been trafficking in stolen government property." But Captain Morrison was a career soldier whose experience with frontier conflicts had taught him to distinguish between legitimate law enforcement and criminal activities disguised as official duty. The scene he encountered spoke for itself: armed men, holding terrified children in conditions that violated every standard of civilized treatment. "Sheriff Klaus," the captain announced with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "you and your men will lay down your weapons immediately and submit to federal custody pending investigation of activities that appear to constitute crimes under territorial and federal statutes." The moment of decision had arrived, and Klaus faced a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of an entire criminal enterprise that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. He could surrender and hope that his connections would protect him through legal proceedings, or he could fight and hope to eliminate enough witnesses to maintain some version of his fabricated story. Klaus chose violence. His shot came without warning, aimed not at the army captain, but at Dr. Marcel, an attempt to eliminate the medical professional whose testimony could provide unshakable evidence of the children's systematic abuse. The bullet caught the doctor in the chest, sending him stumbling backward against stone walls, while blood spread across his white shirt like crimson flowers blooming in snow. But Klaus's act of murder had eliminated any possibility of negotiation or legal resolution that might have preserved some portion of his organization. Captain Morrison's response was swift and merciless. His service revolver speaking with the authority of federal law enforcement facing criminal resistance. The sheriff's badge provided no protection against military justice dispensed at close range. Klaus dropped without ceremony, his weapon clattering across stone floors, while his blood mixed with dust that had been accumulating since the mine's abandonment decades earlier. The battle that followed was brief but decisive, as the remaining deputies found themselves caught between armed fugitives who had nothing left to lose, and federal troops who possessed both superior firepower and absolute legal authority to use it. Most chose surrender over suicide, throwing down their weapons and raising hands that shook with the understanding that their careers in territorial law enforcement had ended permanently. Greasy Pete, true to his nature, attempted to use one of the children as a human shield during the final moments of resistance that had become inevitable once shooting started. But Elise had anticipated such cowardice, and her Winchester spoke with the precision that Chaveo's patient instruction had made possible. The bullet took Pete in the shoulder, spinning him away from his intended victim while simultaneously disabling his gun arm in a display of marksmanship that would have impressed military instructors. The foreman dropped to his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder, while cursing with the creativity that came from years of associating with the territory's most colorful criminals. The reckoning. As army medics tended to Dr. Marcel's wounds and began the delicate process of caring for traumatized children who had endured horrors. No young person should experience the true scope of Klaus's operation became clear through documents recovered from the mine's makeshift headquarters. The correspondence with Judge Webb revealed a criminal enterprise that had corrupted territorial government from top to bottom, using legal authority to provide cover for activities that generated enormous profits, while appearing to serve legitimate administrative functions. Dozens of children had been trafficked through the network, while their families had been destroyed through carefully orchestrated accidents and legal proceedings designed to eliminate inconvenient relatives who might ask awkward questions. This reaches all the way to Washington, Captain Morrison observed as he reviewed evidence that would require federal prosecution rather than territorial legal proceedings. Judge Webb has been filing reports with territorial governors and federal officials that paint his activities as aggressive law enforcement in dangerous frontier regions. But the most devastating evidence came from Klaus's personal records, which detailed payments and procedures with the kind of meticulous documentation that successful criminals maintained to ensure proper compensation for services rendered. The sheriff had kept precise accounts of every child trafficked, every family destroyed, and every official bribe that had made the operation possible. Elise found her sister among the rescued children, though Nellie bore the psychological scars of someone who had witnessed too much cruelty for her tender years. The 10-year-old girl clung to her sister with desperate intensity, as if physical contact could somehow erase the trauma of weeks spent in captivity among people who treated children as merchandise rather than human beings. "I knew you'd come," Nellie whispered through tears that had been held back through sheer force of will during her captivity. "I told the others my sister would find me no matter what." The reunion was everything Elise had hoped for and feared joyful beyond measure, yet shadowed by the understanding that some wounds would take years to heal completely. Her sister was alive and safe, but the innocence that should have been her birthright had been stolen by adults who valued profit more than human dignity. Dr. Marcel's wounds proved serious, but not fatal. Though his recovery would require weeks of careful medical attention that would keep him confined to bed rest while his body healed from trauma that had come dangerously close to ending his life. His testimony would prove crucial in prosecuting the surviving members of Klaus's organization, providing medical evidence of systematic abuse that no defense attorney could credibly dispute. As evening settled over the scene of their final confrontation, Chaveo stood beside the mine entrance and surveyed terrain that had witnessed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of courage that ordinary people could achieve when circumstances demanded heroism from those who had never considered themselves capable of extraordinary deeds. The restoration of order in Willow Springs required 9 days of careful investigation by federal authorities, who arrived to find a community transformed by events that had exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Captain Morrison's cavalry troop was reinforced by federal marshals and territorial officials, whose loyalty to proper law enforcement had been verified through channels independent of Judge Webb's influence. The first priority was caring for the rescued children, a task that fell primarily to Grace Hoffman and the other women of Willow Springs, who possessed both the practical skills and emotional strength necessary to help traumatized young people begin the process of healing from experiences that would mark them for life. Grace transformed the schoolhouse into a temporary medical facility where Dr. Marcel could supervise treatment while recovering from his own wounds. The building's single room became a sanctuary where children could receive both medical care and the kind of patient attention necessary to rebuild trust in adult protection and care. "They're all going to need time," Dr. Marcel explained to Grace as she helped change bandages on wounds both physical and psychological. "Some of these children have been in captivity for months. They've learned to expect cruelty from adults, and unlearning that lesson will require patience and consistency that may test everyone's endurance." Walter Morrison, despite his own injuries from the Saloon brawl that had marked the beginning of open resistance to Klaus's authority, took charge of organizing community support for the children, while federal authorities worked to identify their families and arrange proper placement with relatives who could provide appropriate care. The task proved more complex than anyone had anticipated, as Klaus's network had systematically destroyed family connections through legal proceedings and arranged accidents that eliminated potential guardians who might interfere with trafficking operations. Several children had no surviving relatives, making them wards of territorial government that was itself under investigation for complicity in their abuse. Chaveo spent his convalescence helping Nidus recover from injuries sustained during the mine collapse, while also serving as interpreter and cultural liaison for federal investigators who needed to understand the broader context of Klaus's activities within the complex relationships between Apache bands and territorial authorities. Your testimony will be crucial. Captain Morrison explained during one of several interviews conducted to establish the sequence of events that had led to the final confrontation. Klaus and his associates tried to use anti-Apache sentiment to justify their actions. Your presence as both victim and rescuer contradicts their narrative in ways that will be important during federal prosecution. The investigation revealed that Judge Webb had already fled territorial jurisdiction upon learning of Klaus's capture, disappearing into Mexico with sufficient funds to live comfortably while avoiding extradition proceedings that would eventually result in federal charges for crimes that carried potential death penalties under territorial and federal statutes. But Webb's flight had been anticipated by federal investigators who had been building cases against territorial corruption for months. Before Klaus's operation attracted their attention through patterns of suspicious legal filings and unusual child placement procedures that didn't match normal administrative patterns. We've been watching Webb for over a year, admitted Marshal Harrison, the federal official who had coordinated the investigation from distant offices in Santa Fe. His guardianship filings showed statistical anomalies that suggested systematic abuse of legal procedures for unofficial purposes. The Marshal's revelation provided context for events that had seemed to unfold with impossible speed once Elise took the ledger from Dietrich's safe. Federal authorities had been building cases against territorial corruption, waiting only for evidence that would justify dramatic intervention in local affairs that were normally handled through territorial rather than federal channels. Conrad Dietrich recovered from his injuries, but facing federal charges that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences, chose cooperation over defiance when presented with evidence that made conviction inevitable regardless of his legal strategy. His detailed confession provided names, dates, and financial records that implicated dozens of officials throughout the territorial government. Dietrich's testimony corroborates everything we found in Klaus's records. Marshal Harrison explained as the scope of the criminal network became clear through systematic investigation. This wasn't just local corruption, it was organized crime that used territorial government as a front for activities that generated profits comparable to major mining or cattle operations. The economic impact of the trafficking network had been substantial enough to influence territorial politics through campaign contributions and other forms of financial support that ensured friendly officials remained in positions where they could provide protection for criminal activities that might otherwise attract unwanted law enforcement attention. As federal prosecutors built cases that would eventually result in dozens of indictments and convictions throughout territorial government life, in Willow Springs began returning to something approaching normalcy under new leadership that had been selected for competence and honesty rather than willingness to overlook criminal activities. Eric Johansson, the Swedish baker, whose shop had been damaged during Klaus's final rampage, was elected sheriff by community consensus, an appointment that federal authorities confirmed after verifying his background and ensuring that his authority would be exercised under federal oversight until territorial government could be reformed through proper legal channels. "I never wanted to be sheriff," Eric admitted as he pinned on the badge that had belonged to Klaus until federal justice ended his criminal career permanently. "But someone has to keep order while we rebuild trust in law enforcement that serves people instead of preying on them." The new sheriff's first official act was releasing Walter Morrison from jail and dropping all charges that had been filed during Klaus's campaign to silence opposition to his activities. His second act was hiring Claude Whitmore as deputy, recognizing that the telegraph operator's courage during the crisis had demonstrated exactly the kind of character necessary for honest law enforcement. Dr. Marcel's recovery progressed steadily under Grace's careful nursing, though the physician would carry scars from Klaus's bullet for the remainder of his life. His medical practice expanded as federal authorities provided funding for improved facilities that could serve not only Willow Springs, but also surrounding communities that had been neglected under the previous system of territorial administration. "We're going to build something better," Dr. Marcel promised as he reviewed plans for a new clinic that would serve the entire region's medical needs without regard for patients' ability to pay or their relationships with local political authorities. These children deserve a future where their safety doesn't depend on the whims of corrupt officials. The abandoned homestead where Chaveo had first steadied Elise during her flight from Dietrich became the focus of community reconstruction efforts as federal authorities worked to restore properties that had been seized through fraudulent legal proceedings designed to eliminate inconvenient landowners who might interfere with criminal operations. Legal research revealed that the property had indeed belonged to Marion Brennan Elise and Nellie's aunt, who had purchased it legally before succumbing to fever during their journey west. Dietrich had fraudulently claimed the land after Marion's death, adding property theft to his extensive list of crimes against the Brennan family. With Dietrich's conviction assured and his fraudulent claims invalidated through federal court proceedings, ownership reverted to Marion's legal heirs, Elise and Nellie, providing them with both shelter and the foundation for rebuilding their lives in territory that was finally becoming safe for honest people seeking new opportunities. The barn raising that marked Willow Springs' transformation from lawless frontier town to genuine community took place on a crisp morning 3 weeks after Klaus's death had ended the reign of terror that had gripped the territory for months. The entire community gathered to help construct buildings that would serve not just the Brennan sisters, but also the children who had been rescued from trafficking operations that federal investigation had revealed extending far beyond Arizona into neighboring territories. Grace Hoffman had organized the effort with the efficiency that made her such an effective teacher, coordinating donations of materials and labor from families throughout the region who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to protecting children from the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished under Klaus's protection. "It's not just about building a barn," Grace explained as she supervised the placement of support beams with the precision of someone accustomed to managing complex projects involving reluctant participants. "It's about proving that decent people can work together to create something better than what existed before." Walter Morrison, his arm still in a sling from injuries sustained during his confrontation with Klaus's deputies, provided expertise in construction techniques that would ensure the buildings could withstand both Arizona's harsh weather and the kind of rough use that working structures required in frontier conditions. "These beams need to be anchored deep," he instructed, as community members worked to raise the frame that would support not just roof and walls, but also the hopes of people who had invested everything in creating sanctuary for those who had suffered under the previous system of territorial administration. Chaveo's shoulder had healed sufficiently to allow him to participate in the construction, though Dr. Marcel had insisted on limitations that would prevent re-injury during the healing process that would continue for months. His presence at the barn raising represented something unprecedented in the territory's history: genuine cooperation between Apache and white communities, based on mutual respect rather than fear or exploitation. "My grandfather would not believe this," Nidus observed as he watched his uncle working alongside people who months earlier would have viewed any Apache with suspicion and fear. ND and White Eyes building together instead of fighting over land that belongs to Creator, not to any human tribe. The young Apache's leg had healed crooked, leaving him with a permanent limp that would serve as reminder of the price paid for justice in a territory where corruption had seemed as natural as desert heat. But his spirit remained unbroken, and his role as interpreter between Apache and white communities had made him valuable to federal authorities working to establish more equitable relationships between territorial residents and native peoples. Dr. Marcel supervised the construction from a chair positioned to provide shade, while allowing him to observe progress on buildings that would house the clinic expansion that federal funding had made possible. His recovery had been complicated by infection that required careful treatment, but his determination to resume medical practice had provided motivation that accelerated healing beyond what his age might normally have allowed. The new clinic will have facilities for surgical procedures that I never dreamed possible in a place like Willow Springs, he explained to federal officials who had come to observe the community's transformation under honest leadership. We'll be able to treat injuries and illnesses that previously required travel to distant cities if treatment was available at all. But it was the children who provided the most compelling evidence of positive change. In a community that had learned to measure progress in terms of safety rather than profit. Nellie worked alongside other rescued victims to prepare food for the construction workers, her natural leadership abilities emerging as she organized tasks and settled disputes with the kind of patient diplomacy that suggested strength developed through surviving experiences that would have broken weaker spirits. "She's going to be fine," Elise said, as she watched her sister direct younger children in setting tables with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex household tasks. "It'll take time, but she's stronger than anyone realizes." The observation proved prophetic as afternoon progressed, and the barn's frame took shape under the combined efforts of people who had discovered that cooperation produced better results than the competition and conflict that had characterized territorial life under Klaus's administration. As evening approached and the day's work neared completion, Claude Whitmore arrived with a telegraph message that provided the final surprise in a series of events that had transformed every aspect of life in the territory. "A message from Santa Fe," Claude announced as he handed the telegram to Captain Morrison, whose cavalry troop had remained in Willow Springs to provide security during the transition to honest territorial government. "Federal prosecutors have reached agreement with Judge Webb." The judge's capture in Mexico had been accomplished through diplomatic channels that allowed his extradition to face federal charges for crimes that included not only trafficking and corruption, but also treason for his attempts to use territorial authority to resist federal law enforcement. His cooperation with prosecutors had provided evidence that implicated officials throughout the territorial government and several neighboring jurisdictions. Webb has provided detailed testimony about criminal networks operating throughout the Southwest. Captain Morrison explained as he read the telegram's contents to the assembled crowd. His cooperation has resulted in arrests and indictments in 4 territories, effectively dismantling organized crime that had been operating under government protection for over a decade. But the most significant news in the telegram concerned financial restitution that federal courts had ordered for victims of the trafficking network. Webb's seized assets, combined with property and funds recovered from other convicted participants, would provide substantial compensation for families that had been destroyed by the criminal enterprise. "Each family affected by trafficking operations will receive compensation sufficient to rebuild their lives," the captain announced. "Children who lost parents to arranged accidents will receive funds held in trust until they reach majority age, while those who suffered directly will receive immediate compensation for medical care and rehabilitation." For Elise and Nellie, the restitution meant financial security that would allow them to rebuild their lives without the constant worry about survival that had driven desperate decisions during their first months in the territory. More importantly, it represented acknowledgement by federal government that their suffering had been real and that justice required more than simply punishing those responsible for inflicting harm. As the community celebration continued into the evening, Chaveo and Elise found themselves standing together on the porch of the house they had rebuilt with their own hands and the help of neighbors who had proven that cooperation could overcome the legacy of violence and corruption that had once seemed insurmountable. "Me back at the start," Elise said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them as stars appeared in desert sky that seemed larger and more welcoming than it had during their desperate flight across hostile territory. "I told you, it was too late for me." Chaveo looked out at horizon, where distant mountains stood silhouetted against sunset that painted clouds in shades of gold and crimson, his dark eyes reflecting light that seemed to come from sources deeper than mere fire. "Out here, it's too late. Only when we quit trying to make things better," he replied without turning from his contemplation of landscape that had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. She nodded, once understanding flowing between them without need for elaborate declarations or promises about futures that remained uncertain despite their victory over forces that had once seemed insurmountable. They were survivors who had learned to depend on each other through trials that had tested every aspect of their character and courage, building trust that went deeper than romantic attraction or simple partnership. The wind sighed through cottonwood trees as night settled over Arizona territory, carrying with it the sound of children's laughter and adult conversation that spoke of communities learning to live by principles of justice rather than expedience. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing off rock formations that had watched countless human struggles across centuries of conflict and cooperation. But here, on this reclaimed patch of earth, where two people from different worlds had chosen to make their stand against injustice, peace had finally found refuge in the understanding that some victories are worth whatever price they demand from those brave enough to fight for what is right.